I know the title may seem a little bit harsh, but it's true. Mercedes are clueless about their 2024 car, and it's sadly a pattern, really, that they've had for the past 3 years. I want to get straight into this and share what Toto Wolff has said after the Australian Grand Prix, so we can discuss it. He said, "We weren't sure about our suspension. We weren't sure about the stiffness of our gearbox carrier. We had a vibrating steering rack, and all of those things have disappeared. But fundamentally, whatever we see in the tunnel doesn't correlate with what's happening on the track. Sometimes it takes time because back in my Williams days, I knew what was missing. But here, I don't think we're missing something. It is just a complication of what's happening with the car that we can't see. And it's like an on-off switch." He then went on to say, "We are coming to a point now where we probably need to experiment every single race. And not only on Friday, because our performance seems to get worse throughout the weekend. We are good on Friday, and then we are good on some of the sessions on Saturday, but the more grip we have, the faster it goes, and the more we reach the performance ceiling of the car. Our data shows that it's not the ceiling." You may remember back in 2022, Mercedes were very confident with their concept. Even when they struggled early on, they believed their concept had a lot of potential. They believed it was the right one. Their wind tunnel was saying there is so much speed in this car, but they couldn't turn that into potential in reality on the track. At the start of this season, though, they were confident that those sorts of issues were behind them. They seemed to say in testing that the car was correlating to the simulator. They were making setup changes in the simulator in real life, and that all seemed to tally up. 3 races in, though, that no longer seems to be the case, with Toto Wolff going back to this issue with correlation. He said this: "We have a big problem. Our sensors and our simulations say that in a certain speed range, we should have a certain amount of downforce, but in reality, we don't." In Jeddah, both Mercedes drivers struggled in the high-speed sections of the track. That's something we saw quite clearly with Hamilton, both defending from Piastri and trying to attack Norris. The high-speed sections of the track were the biggest loss for Mercedes, and part of that was due to bouncing. The drivers felt very uncomfortable and couldn't push the cars in those sections because it was unpredictable. Merc were running the car really low, and the bouncing was just unsettling the car, and the drivers just had no confidence in it. They were really strong, though, in the rest of the circuit, and that made up for their downfall. In Australia, though, it was the opposite. Mercedes raised the floor a little bit. This meant that they didn't have as much bouncing, and the drivers felt more confident through the high-speed sections, and they were actually pretty quick through those sections. The downside of that, though, is that they were worse in the slower speed sections. They can't quite get that balance right. They're taking downforce from one area, putting it in another area, but they can't seem to get the balance across all corners. It's one thing to be slow, but at least they're reliable. Except now we're not so sure that they are. In Australia, Hamilton had an engine failure. We're not really sure the extent of the issue yet. But in the season opener in Bahrain, both drivers had severe overheating. And they say that was due to improper cooling. They choose the wrong cooling. But how are they choosing the wrong cooling? They did so much testing there. The painful thing for Mercedes is that the drivers, for the most part, are reporting that the car feels a lot better than last year. Hamilton has definitely been experimenting with setups. We know that's something he's been doing over the past few years. He's trying to find that silver bullet. But as a whole, both drivers have said that the car feels a lot better than the past few years. They're just missing downforce and then ultimately performance. Except the Mercedes simulations and data is saying that the downforce should be there, but it's not. We have to remember that Mercedes have changed a lot this year. They redesigned their gearbox. Obviously, they made changes visually to the aerodynamics, and they changed their rear suspension. When you watch Red Bull, especially going over the bumps, their rear suspension works so well. It takes the bumps so well, and the car glides. Sure, it hits bumps just like every other car, but it deals with them really, really well. Mercedes have changed their rear suspension to try and balance the aero, improve the efficiency of the floor, take the bumps, but it's still not on the level of Red Bull, and I can't imagine that is their only issue either. One thing is clear to me, that no matter how hard it is to hear for the Mercedes fans, they clearly don't understand this era of car, the ground effect era. It's quite clear now that 3 years in, they're still having the same problems. Porpoising was an issue for a lot of teams in the first year, apart from probably Red Bull. And other teams still do have bouncing to an extent. Ferrari have a little bit of it. They had a lot more last year. But Mercedes seems to be the one team who are heavily affected by it. They have a lot of bouncing and they can't seem to get on top of it. There's no balance between performance and ride height for them at the minute. Hamilton's come out and said that this is the worst Formula One season start that he's had. And Mercedes have had a woeful start themselves. In 2021, they had 101 points after 3 races. Then, in 2022, they had 77. Still a decent haul despite having a poor car. Then, in 2023, it went down to 56 points. This year, they've had only 26 after 3 races. Yes, they had a double DNF in Australia, but neither driver was in for a big haul of points before that DNF. The truth is that despite changing their concept and despite the fact that both drivers are saying the car is better to drive, Mercedes have been getting worse over the past 3 years and not better. It's still a long way to go in the season, and we do have to give them some time because they've made a big change over the winter and other teams are going to be a little bit ahead in their learning. But their own customer teams, Aston Martin and McLaren, are now consistently better than them, McLaren especially. And the truth is, it doesn't look like it's going to change anytime soon. There's rumours they're going to hold back their upgrades until they get a better understanding of the car, and they're just going to keep experimenting until they hopefully find something. And that's not exactly the way that a team that's won the Constructors' title 8 times in the past 10 years should be operating, but that's where they're at. And I don't think blame should be thrown around either. Mike Elliott, he was hung out to dry a little bit, especially when it was confirmed that James Allison was coming back to the team. But in fairness, the concept clearly wasn't the only issue at Mercedes, because they're having similar problems now with an entirely different car. Mercedes have a little bit of time now before Japan, another fast circuit, and they're going to hope to find something in this gap, but I'm not optimistic. Either way, we'll find out at Japan. I hope you've enjoyed this video. As always, like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.